Most people don't change their lives because they're lazy or incapable or unaware. Most people don't change their lives because they're doing one very specific thing over and over again, usually with the best intentions. And they don't realize that this very thing is quietly canceling everything they're trying to create. Nothing changed for me until I stopped doing this. And what I want to talk to you about today isn't flashy, it isn't mystical, and it isn't something most manifestation content emphasizes, but it is foundational. And if you really let this sink in, it will explain why you've tried so many things, learned so much, and yet still feel like you're standing in the same place. Here's the uncomfortable truth most people never say out loud. You don't fail to manifest because you're doing too little. You fail because you're doing too much of the wrong thing internally. You are constantly trying to fix yourself. You are constantly monitoring your progress. You are constantly checking whether it's working yet. And that inner habit keeps you anchored to the very state you're trying to leave. Think about how often your attention goes to what hasn't changed yet. You wake up and you scan your life. Is the money here yet? Is the relationship different yet? Do I feel better yet? Did my mindset finally shift? That checking might feel responsible, even motivated, but it subtly reinforces a single message to your nervous system and your subconscious. Nothing is done yet. I'm still waiting. I'm still behind. I'm still incomplete. That inner stance is what keeps things frozen. Nothing changed for me until I stopped treating my life like a problem to solve and started treating it like a state to stabilize. That shift alone removed more resistance than years of techniques ever did. And most people miss this because they're taught that growth is about constant effort, constant improvement, constant correction. But manifestation doesn't respond to effort the way we've been conditioned to believe. It responds to identity, to expectation, to what feels settled inside of you. Here's something practical you can notice right now. Look at the areas of your life that feel stuck. Then look at how often you mentally revisit them, how often you analyze them, how often you rehearse what's wrong, even subtly. That repetition isn't neutral. It's conditioning. You are training your system to stay familiar with lack, not because you want to, but because familiarity feels safer than the unknown. So the first thing I stopped doing, and the first thing I want you to experiment with, is this. Stop narrating the problem to yourself. Stop mentally explaining why it hasn't happened yet. Stop reviewing the evidence of what's missing, not because you're in denial, but because every time you rehearse the absence, you reinforce it. This doesn't mean you pretend everything's perfect. It means you stop feeding the loop that keeps your identity anchored to waiting. Most people think manifestation is about adding something new. New affirmations, new techniques, new routines. But real shifts usually come from subtraction, removing the inner habits that quietly sabotage you, removing the constant self-surveillance, removing the emotional checking, removing the pressure you put on yourself to feel different before you allow life to move. Here's another practical piece most people overlook. Your nervous system does not move towards what feels forced. It moves towards what feels safe and normal. If the life you want feels emotionally unfamiliar, your system will resist it, even if your mind says you want it. And the fastest way to make something feel unsafe is to obsess over it. So instead of asking, how do I get this? Ask something far more powerful. How do I stop signaling that I don't have it yet? How do I stop living in the posture of almost not yet someday? One simple practice that helped me immensely was this. I stopped checking for internal confirmation. I stopped asking myself whether I believed enough, aligned enough, healed enough. Every time I noticed myself scanning my inner world for progress, I gently redirected my attention to what was already stable. My breath, my body, the room I was in. Something neutral and present. This grounded me back into now instead of future chasing. That alone changed my emotional baseline. And when your baseline changes, your results follow. Most people try to manifest from a state of tension disguised as hope. They're hopeful but tight, optimistic but vigilant. And that vigilance is the thing that keeps life from rearranging. When you finally stop gripping the outcome, you send a very different signal. You signal that you are not waiting for permission to be okay. You are already here. Nothing changed for me until I stopped living as if my life was about to begin. Until I stopped rehearsing, becoming, and started inhabiting being. And this isn't philosophical, it's practical. It shows up in how you make decisions, how you speak to yourself, how you move through ordinary moments. So for now, Don't try to manifest anything new. That's important. Instead, notice what you keep doing internally that reinforces waiting. Notice how often you check. Notice how often you measure. Notice how often you correct yourself and gently interrupt that pattern. This is the foundation. Before anything can move externally, something must settle internally. And in the next part, we're going to look at the second thing I stopped doing and that created real momentum, not through effort, but through release. Nothing truly shifted for me until I stopped confusing movement with progress. For a long time, I was always doing something, reading another book, watching another video, trying another method, adjusting my mindset again and again. From the outside, it looked like dedication. It looked like growth. But underneath all of that motion was a quiet assumption I never questioned. I'm not there yet. Something about me still needs fixing. That belief kept me busy, but it also kept me waiting. Most people never realize this, but constant self-improvement can quietly become a form of resistance. It feels responsible, it feels mature. But when your identity is always organized around becoming, you are never allowed to arrive. You live in preparation mode, and preparation mode subtly trains your nervous system to expect delay. Life is always about to begin, never quite here. Think about how often this shows up in ordinary thoughts. Once I heal this, then things will change. Once I'm more confident, then opportunities will open. Once I'm more aligned, then I'll feel at ease. Each thought sounds logical on its own. Together, they form a powerful assumption. I am not ready yet. Reality responds to assumptions, not intentions. Nothing began to move until I stopped postponing my own arrival, until I stopped treating wholeness like a prize at the end of a long internal race. The moment I stopped trying to become someone else and started stabilizing where I already was, something softened. And in that softening, momentum appeared. There is something deeply liberating about no longer framing your life as a project that needs constant correction. Growth still happens, but it happens organically, not from pressure. You stop relating to yourself as a problem to be solved and start relating to yourself as a place life can move through. This shift doesn't come from dramatic declarations. It comes from subtle changes in how you meet each moment, from allowing yourself to be present without needing to justify your readiness, from acting without checking whether you've earned the right to act yet. When I stopped telling myself that life would start later, I noticed how much energy was suddenly available. Energy that had been trapped in self-monitoring, self-correcting, and self-evaluating. That energy didn't disappear. It became clarity. It became calm. It became trust. And trust is not something you force. It's something that emerges when you stop arguing with where you are. I also had to see how much stability I was outsourcing to future outcomes. I believed that once something external shifted, I would finally feel settled. But that logic was inverted. The settling had to come first. Not pretending everything was perfect, but allowing myself to stop fighting the present moment as if it were an enemy. You cannot create from a state of internal protest. When part of you is constantly saying, this shouldn't be happening, another part of you stays anchored to exactly what you're resisting. Resistance consumes enormous energy. When I stopped bracing against the now and allowed myself to stand in it without commentary, something inside me relaxed. That relaxation wasn't passive. It was powerful. It created space. And space is what allows new patterns to form. This is where many teachings miss the mark. They talk about raising your state without explaining how much tension comes from trying to escape the current one. They encourage positivity without addressing regulation. But suppressed tension always leaks. Forced optimism always collapses. When I stopped using ideas as a way to bypass my own humanity, my inner world became quieter, more stable, less reactive. And from that stability, action stopped feeling frantic. Choices stopped feeling desperate. Desire stopped feeling heavy. This is the quiet work most people overlook because it doesn't feel dramatic. It doesn't come with instant fireworks. But it changes everything because it changes how you inhabit yourself. And how you inhabit yourself determines what life can do through you. You don't move life by becoming extraordinary. You move life by becoming internally consistent. When your inner stance stops swinging between hope and disappointment and settles into a grounded sense of okayness, reality finally has something solid to organize around. Once that internal pressure eased, I began to notice something else that had been quietly sabotaging change for years. My relationship with effort. I had been taught, directly and indirectly, that if something wasn't working yet, the answer was always more intensity, more focus, more discipline, more trying. And while effort has its place, there is a point where effort stops building and starts constricting. Effort driven by fear feels very different from effort driven by clarity. Fear-based effort is tight. It rushes. It carries a subtle panic underneath it, as if something bad will happen if you stop pushing. Clarity-based effort is calm. It's deliberate. It doesn't need to prove anything. When I looked honestly at my own behavior, I saw how much of what I called effort was actually fear in motion. Fear of falling behind. Fear of missing out. Fear of not becoming who I was supposed to be. That fear made everything heavier than it needed to be. Even good opportunities felt stressful because they carried the weight of expectation. I wasn't engaging with life. I was negotiating with it. And negotiations are exhausting. Nothing began to change until I stopped trying to force outcomes and started focusing on coherence. Coherence means your thoughts, emotions, and actions are pointing in the same direction without friction. It doesn't mean you're always confident. It means you're not internally split. For example, I would say I wanted freedom, but my daily habits were organized around control. I would say I wanted ease, but my inner dialogue was relentless. I would say I trusted life, but I constantly checked for proof that it was working. Those contradictions mattered more than any technique I was practicing. So instead of asking, what should I do next, I started asking a different question. Where am I internally divided right now? Where am I saying one thing but living another? Where am I acting from habit instead of truth? This question is practical because it immediately brings awareness to leverage points. You don't need to overhaul your life. You need to reduce internal contradiction. When contradiction drops, energy frees itself naturally. One of the most useful practices I adopted was pausing before action and checking the emotional quality underneath it. Am I doing this because it feels aligned or because I'm afraid not to? Am I reaching out because it feels natural or because I'm trying to secure an outcome? Am I improving because I'm curious or because I feel inadequate? You don't judge the answer, you simply notice. Awareness alone starts to recalibrate behavior. When action comes from fear, it reinforces fear regardless of the result. When action comes from alignment, it strengthens trust regardless of the result. This is why two people can do the same thing and have completely different experiences. The external behavior looks identical. The internal state is not. As I reduced fear-driven effort, something unexpected happened. My timing improved. I stopped forcing conversations that weren't ready. I stopped chasing clarity before it had fully formed. I allowed decisions to ripen instead of extracting them prematurely. And because of that, when I did move, things moved with me. This is a subtle but profound shift. You stop trying to outpace life and start walking in rhythm with it. And rhythm creates momentum without burnout. I also noticed how much my nervous system had been conditioned to urgency. Rest used to feel unproductive. Stillness felt suspicious. If I wasn't actively pushing, I felt like I was falling behind. But that was conditioning, not truth. When I allowed myself to slow down without labeling it as failure, my perception sharpened. I saw options I'd been too busy to notice. Clarity does not come from speed. It comes from space. So I began treating my inner state as the primary environment I needed to tend. Not my circumstances. Not my schedule. My internal climate. Was it hostile or hospitable? Was it rushed or grounded? Was it constantly bracing for impact, or did it allow for flow? You can't build a meaningful life on a foundation that's always tense. Tension collapses creativity. It narrows perception. It shortens patience. When I stopped treating tension as a badge of seriousness and started seeing it as a signal, my choices changed. And that's when things began to align in a way that didn't require constant effort to maintain. Because alignment sustains itself. Once that alignment began to stabilize, I started to see another pattern that had quietly kept me stuck for a long time. My attachment to immediate validation. I didn't realize how often I measured progress by visible results instead of internal movement. If something didn't change quickly on the outside, I assumed nothing was happening at all, and that assumption kept pulling me back into old behaviors. Most people abandon real change, not because it isn't working, but because it isn't loud enough yet. Internal shifts are subtle. They don't announce themselves. They don't come with fireworks. They show up as slightly calmer reactions, slightly different choices, slightly more patience in moments where you used to rush. And if you're only looking for dramatic external proof, you will miss the fact that your foundation is already changing. I had to learn how to recognize progress differently. Instead of asking, did I get what I wanted yet? I began asking, am I responding differently than I used to? That question revealed real movement. Less reactivity, less urgency, more discernment, more trust in my own timing. That internal change matters because the world doesn't respond to what you want. It responds to what you consistently reinforce. If your nervous system is still wired for scarcity, even good outcomes won't feel satisfying. They'll feel temporary, fragile, easy to lose. So you'll unconsciously sabotage them or overwork them. I started focusing on stabilizing the state I wanted to live from before demanding results from it. If I wanted peace, I practiced not abandoning myself when uncertainty appeared. If I wanted confidence, I practiced making decisions without rehearsing failure in advance. If I wanted abundance, I practiced letting enough be enough instead of constantly scanning for what was missing. These are small practices, but they compound. One of the most practical things I did was change how I spoke to myself during pauses. Not during action, during pauses. The moments between steps reveal your true conditioning. When nothing is happening externally, does your mind spiral or does it rest? Does it narrate danger or does it stay neutral? That inner narration is shaping your next move, whether you realize it or not. So when I noticed my mind filling silence with doubt, I didn't fight it. I softened it. I reminded myself that not moving yet didn't mean nothing was happening. I let silence become fertile instead of threatening. Another shift was letting go of the idea that clarity has to feel certain. Real clarity often feels quiet, not confident. It doesn't shout. It doesn't argue. It doesn't need reassurance. It simply feels clean. When I stopped expecting clarity to feel like certainty, I stopped waiting for permission to move. That alone changed my momentum. I also stopped outsourcing trust. I had been waiting for circumstances to prove I was safe to relax, safe to choose differently, safe to stop pushing. But safety doesn't come from evidence. It comes from repetition. You build it by choosing alignment again and again, even when the old patterns try to pull you back. The more I stayed with that, the less I needed reassurance. I didn't need constant signs that I was on the right path. I needed consistency with the internal shift I had already made. And here's the part that most people don't like to hear. Growth requires boredom. It requires doing the right thing before it feels exciting. It requires trusting the process during phases where nothing seems to be happening. If you only change when you're inspired, you'll always return to old patterns when things get quiet. I stopped chasing emotional highs as proof of alignment. I started valuing steadiness instead. Calm, reliability, presence. That's when life began to feel less like a series of problems to solve, and more like a process I was participating in. This is where change becomes sustainable. Not because you're forcing it, but because you're no longer fighting yourself. And once that fight ends, energy returns. Choices simplify. The next step becomes obvious, not because you figured it out, but because you're finally clear enough to see it. There was another layer that revealed itself as soon as I stopped relying on urgency as a motivator. For a long time, pressure had been the fuel. Deadlines, fear of falling behind, the belief that if I didn't stay tense, everything would collapse. That pressure felt productive, but it was quietly draining my ability to hear myself. Urgency narrows perception. It forces you into survival mode. When you're rushing internally, every decision feels heavy. Every mistake feels dangerous, and every pause feels like failure. Living from that state makes you reactive instead of responsive. You move fast, but not necessarily in the right direction. I began experimenting with removing urgency from decisions that weren't actually urgent. Not life or death choices, just everyday ones. I slowed my speech. I paused before replying. I allowed decisions to take a breath before locking them in. That alone changed the quality of my outcomes. When urgency leaves, discernment enters. Practical change started showing up in the simplest ways. I stopped multitasking as a badge of honor. I gave full attention to one thing at a time. I noticed how often I rushed through moments I claimed to care about. Conversations, meals, work I said mattered. Slowing down revealed how much of my dissatisfaction came from being mentally absent. Another adjustment was how I handled resistance. I used to treat resistance as something to push through or eliminate. Now I treated it as information. If something felt heavy, I didn't shame myself for it. I asked what part of me felt unsafe or unconvinced. Resistance usually wasn't laziness. It was misalignment. So instead of forcing action, I clarified the internal story. If I was avoiding something, I explored why. Was I expecting perfection? Was I fearing judgment? Was I operating from an outdated belief about who I had to be? Changing the story changed the energy behind the action. I also stopped confusing effort with effectiveness. Doing more doesn't mean moving forward. Sometimes it means you're compensating for uncertainty. When effort comes from clarity, it feels clean. When it comes from fear, it feels frantic. Learning the difference saved me time, energy, and frustration. A very practical practice that grounded this shift was simplifying goals. I stopped stacking expectations on top of one another. Instead of trying to fix everything at once, I focused on stabilizing one internal state at a time. Peace first, then consistency, then growth. That order matters. The world doesn't respond well to scattered intention. It responds to coherence. When your inner world's organized, your outer actions carry more weight. I also became more selective about what I consumed mentally. Not everything deserves your attention just because it's available. Constant stimulation keeps your nervous system dysregulated. I limited inputs that reinforced anxiety, comparison, or scarcity. I chose information that expanded perspective rather than triggered urgency. This wasn't about positivity, it was about regulation. The more regulated I became, the more natural my confidence felt. Confidence stopped being something I tried to project and became something I inhabited. That changed how people responded to me. Not because I was trying to impress, but because I was present. Life started responding differently because I was showing up differently, not louder, not harder, more grounded. That's when it became clear. Nothing had changed, because I was trying to change everything at once. The shift happened when I committed to moving from stability instead of pressure, from alignment instead of force, from awareness instead of habit. This isn't about doing less. It's about doing what matters from the right place. When that happens, momentum builds without burnout. Clarity sharpens without stress, and growth stops feeling like a battle. And that's when change stops feeling temporary and starts feeling like who you are becoming. By the time I reached this point, it became obvious that the real transformation had very little to do with circumstances and everything to do with self-trust. Not the loud kind of confidence that needs to be announced, but the quiet kind that doesn't need reassurance. The kind that lets you move forward without needing every step to be guaranteed. Most people are waiting to feel certain before they act, but certainty rarely arrives first. What arrives first is a willingness to move without internal resistance. When that resistance softens, direction becomes clearer. Not because life suddenly provides answers, but because you stop drowning them out with noise. I stopped asking what would work and started asking what felt honest. That one shift changed the quality of my decisions. Honest choices may feel uncomfortable at first, but they don't fracture you internally. They don't require constant justification. They create coherence between thought, emotion, and action. That coherence is what produces momentum that lasts. One of the most practical things I learned was how to recognize when I was about to override myself. The body knows before the mind does. Tightness, hesitation, a subtle pull backward. Instead of ignoring those signals, I began listening. Not obeying fear, but distinguishing it from intuition. Fear feels frantic. Intuition feels calm, even when it says no. This awareness saved me from repeating old cycles. I stopped committing to things out of obligation. I stopped chasing outcomes that looked good on paper but felt empty in reality. I started allowing alignment to be the filter, not external validation. As this became habitual, effort transformed. Work no longer felt like resistance management. Creativity returned. Energy stabilized. Progress became sustainable. Not because life became easier, but because I stopped making it harder than it needed to be. What most people overlook is that change doesn't require a dramatic overhaul. It requires consistency in small internal agreements. The agreement to pause instead of panic, to choose clarity over urgency, to act from grounded intention rather than reaction. These decisions compound quietly until one day you realize your life feels different. Not perfect, not problem-free, but steady, directed, yours. And that's the moment everything finally shifts. Not because you forced it, but because you stopped interfering with it. You stopped abandoning yourself in the name of progress. You stopped chasing what you thought you needed to become, and started honoring who you already were. Nothing changed until I stopped doing that. And when I did, life didn't suddenly become extraordinary. It became aligned. And from that place, everything I had been working toward finally had room to arrive. This is the work. This is the shift. And once you experience it, you don't need convincing. You feel it.